Story 1. It was a quiet Tuesday night on patrol, the kind of night where you start to wonder if everyone in town decided to behave themselves for once. I'd been cruising the empty streets for hours, only the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio to keep me company. Around 2 a.m., I was heading down a long stretch of country road on the outskirts of town when I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. The car behind me was moving erratically, swerving between lanes. Textbook drunk driver. I slowed down, letting them catch up, then hit the lights and pulled them over. As I approached the vehicle, an old blue sedan, I noticed the windows were so heavily tinted I couldn't make out the driver. I tapped on the glass with my flashlight. "License and registration, please." The window rolled down, revealing nothing. The car was completely empty. I stepped back, heart pounding. This had to be some kind of joke, right? I circled the vehicle, checking for any sign of the driver, but found nothing. The engine was still running, radio playing softly. I radioed for backup, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. While waiting, I ran the plates. They came back registered to a John Doe who'd been dead for 15 years. My partner arrived about 10 minutes later. As soon as he pulled up, the blue sedan's engine revved loudly. Before either of us could react, it peeled out, tires squealing as it sped off into the night. We gave chase, but somehow that old beater was faster than our cruiser. We lost sight of it after a few miles and had to give up the pursuit. Back at the station, we filed our report. My partner was convinced it was just some kids playing a prank with a remote-controlled car. But I knew what I saw or didn't see. That car was empty, and no RC vehicle could move like that. A few days later, I was looking through some old case files when I came across a fatal accident report from 15 years ago. A man named John Doe had run his blue sedan off that same stretch of road, dying on impact. The photos showed a car identical to the one I'd pulled over. I tried to rationalize it, tell myself there had to be a logical explanation, but deep down, I knew the truth. I'd had an encounter with something beyond explanation that night. Since then, I've heard whispers from other officers about similar experiences on that road. A phantom car that appears on quiet nights, luring officers into an impossible traffic stop before vanishing into thin air. Some say it's the ghost of John Doe, endlessly reliving his final drive. Others think it's something darker, feeding off the fear and confusion it creates. All I know is that I avoid that stretch of road on the night shift now. And whenever I see a blue sedan in my rearview mirror, my blood runs cold. Because for a brief moment, I'm back there on that lonely road, staring into an empty car and questioning everything I thought I knew about reality. I've never told this story officially. Who would believe me? But I know what I experienced that night was real. And I often wonder, how many other unexplainable things have we encountered on the job, only to dismiss them or bury them deep in our minds? What else is out there in the dark, just beyond the reach of our flashlights and our understanding? Sometimes I think about quitting, finding a nice safe desk job where the strangest thing I might encounter is a paper cut. But then I remember why I became a cop in the first place, to protect and serve. And if there are things out there beyond our comprehension, things that might pose a danger to the people of this town, well, someone's got to be out there, ready to face them. So I keep patrolling, night after night. But now I do it with a new awareness that the world is stranger and more mysterious than I ever imagined. And whenever I pull someone over, there's always that moment of hesitation before they roll down the window. That split second where I wonder, will I be looking into the eyes of a normal citizen, or will I find myself staring into the unknown once again? I don't have any answers, only questions. But I do know this: being a cop means being ready for anything, even if that anything defies all logic and reason. So if you're ever driving down a dark, lonely road, late at night and see flashing lights in your rearview mirror, do us both a favor. Pull over quickly, keep your hands visible, and whatever you do, don't vanish into thin air. Story 2. I've been on the force for over 2 decades, and I've seen my fair share of strange things, but nothing quite compares to what happened at the old Thornhill place last autumn. It's the kind of experience that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world. It started with a routine call, a noise complaint from 1123 Maple Street. The dispatcher mentioned it was Mrs. Abernathy again, an elderly widow known for her frequent calls about disturbances. Most of us chalked it up to loneliness or maybe the beginnings of dementia. I'd been there a few times before, always finding nothing out of the ordinary, just a frail old woman in a house too big for her, jumping at shadows. This time felt different from the moment I pulled up to the curb. The Victorian-style house loomed against the darkening sky, its windows like empty eyes staring down at me. A chill ran down my spine as I approached the porch, the old wooden steps creaking under my weight. Mrs. Abernathy answered the door before I could knock, her thin face pale and drawn. "Officer Jensen," she said, her voice quavering. "Thank goodness you're here. It's gotten worse." I stepped inside, the familiar, musty smell of old books and mothballs filling my nostrils. "What's gotten worse, Mrs. Abernathy?" She wrung her hands, glancing nervously around the dimly lit foyer. "The voices, they're clearer now. And I saw something, a shadow moving on its own." I'd heard this before, but something in her tone made me take it more seriously this time. "Can you show me where?" She led me to the kitchen, a large room with outdated appliances and faded wallpaper. "It was right there," she pointed to a corner near the pantry. "A dark shape, like a person, but not quite." I walked over to investigate, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Nothing seemed out of place. I was about to turn back when I felt it, a sudden, intense cold spot. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Mrs. Abernathy, do you feel that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded, hugging herself. "It happens sometimes, like someone left a freezer open, but it's just in one spot." I'd dealt with drafts before, but this was different. The cold was concentrated, almost solid. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, just on the edge of hearing. I couldn't make out words, but it was definitely there. "I'm going to check the rest of the house," I told Mrs. Abernathy. "Why don't you wait in the living room?" As I moved through the old house, things got stranger. In the upstairs hallway, I distinctly heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing there. In the master bedroom, I watched in disbelief as a door slowly swung shut on its own. By the time I got back downstairs, I was shaken. I prided myself on being rational, on finding logical explanations for things, but what I'd experienced defied easy answers. Mrs. Abernathy was waiting for me, a sad smile on her face. "You've seen it now, haven't you? I'm not crazy." I sat down heavily in an armchair. "No, Mrs. Abernathy, you're not crazy, but I don't know what to make of this." She sighed, looking suddenly very old and very tired. "It started about 6 months ago. Just little things at first. Items not where I left them. Cold spots. Then the whispers began. I thought I was losing my mind. I took out my notebook, professionalism kicking in despite my unease. Has anything changed recently? Any renovations? New items brought into the house?" She shook her head. "Nothing like that, but..." She hesitated. "I did find something. In the attic." Mrs. Abernathy led me up to the attic, a cluttered space full of dusty furniture and old boxes. She pointed to a trunk in the corner. It was hidden behind some old paintings. I'd never seen it before. Inside the trunk were newspapers from the 1950s, all featuring the same headline: "Double Murder Shocks Quiet Neighborhood." The articles detailed the brutal killing of a young couple in their home, 1123 Maple Street. "I had no idea," Mrs. Abernathy whispered. "We bought the house in the 70s. No one ever mentioned." Over the next few weeks, I found myself spending more and more time at the Thornhill house. Off-duty, of course. I told myself it was to keep an eye on Mrs. Abernathy. But the truth was, I was fascinated, obsessed even. I dug into the old case files, learning about Thomas and Eleanor Thornhill, newlyweds found dead in their bedroom. The killer was never caught. As I delved deeper, strange things kept happening in the house. Objects would move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The whispers grew louder, though I could never quite make out the words. One night as I was leaving, I saw a shadow figure at the top of the stairs. Just for a moment, but unmistakable. I ran up to investigate, but found nothing. When I came back down, Mrs. Abernathy was waiting. "You can't help them," she said softly. "I've tried. The best we can do is listen." I wanted to argue to insist there had to be a rational explanation, but I knew deep down that I'd encountered something beyond my understanding, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. I still check in on Mrs. Abernathy regularly. The activity in the house seems to have calmed down, but there's always a tension in the air, like the place is holding its breath. Sometimes when it's quiet, I swear I can hear faint whispers carried on the wind. I've never officially reported what happened at the Thornhill house. Who would believe me? But it's changed me, made me realize that there are things out there we can't explain, can't rationalize away. As cops, we're trained to look for logical answers, to follow the evidence. But sometimes the evidence leads us to places we're not prepared to go. Sometimes we have to accept that there are mysteries in this world that go beyond our understanding. I still patrol the streets every night, still respond to calls and write up reports, but now I do it with a new awareness, an openness to possibilities I would have dismissed before, because I know now that reality is stranger and more complex than we can imagine. And sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, I find myself driving past 1123 Maple Street. I never stop, never go in, but as I pass, I swear I can hear whispers on the wind, secrets longing to be heard. And I wonder what other mysteries are out there, waiting to be uncovered in the darkness. Story 3. It was just another Tuesday night on patrol in our sleepy Colorado town when the call came in. Dispatch's voice crackled over the radio, a hint of amusement in her tone. Unit 17, we've got a 1091V at 1542 Aspen Drive. Caller claims there's a ghost in her attic. I sighed, already imagining some bored teenager playing pranks or an overly imaginative retiree. But a call's a call, so I flipped on the lights and headed over. The house was one of those cookie-cutter McMansions that had sprung up like weeds on the outskirts of town. As I pulled up, I saw a woman in her early 40s pacing on the perfectly manicured lawn, wringing her hands. "Ma'am," I called as I approached. "I'm Officer Reeves." "You called about a disturbance?" She whirled to face me, eyes wide. "Oh, thank God you're here. It's been going on for days now. The screaming, the banging. I thought I was losing my mind." I raised an eyebrow. "And you believe this is supernatural in nature?" She nodded vigorously. "What else could it be? I live alone, no pets, and the neighbors are all away for the ski season." I'd heard it all before, but something in her voice made me take it a bit more seriously. "All right, ma'am, I'll take a look. Could you show me to the attic access?" She led me inside, pointing to a trap door in the ceiling of the upstairs hallway. "Up there, but I'm not going anywhere near it." I pulled down the ladder and climbed up, flashlight in hand. The attic was a mess of cobwebs and dust, old furniture draped in sheets like pale ghosts. As I swept my light around, I caught a glint of something in the far corner. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the space, followed by a muffled cry. I nearly jumped out of my skin, my hand instinctively going to my weapon. "Hello," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is the police. Come out where I can see you." Another bang, another cry. It sounded pained. I cautiously made my way toward the source of the noise, pushing aside a stack of old boxes. What I found was the last thing I expected. A man, probably in his 60s, was huddled in the corner. His leg was caught in a hole in the floor, and he looked like he hadn't eaten in days. "Oh, thank God," he croaked when he saw me. "I thought I was gonna die up here." I helped him free his leg and get to his feet. "Sir, what on earth are you doing up here?" He looked sheepish. "Name's Frank. I used to own this place. Lost it in the divorce last year. Been living on the streets since then." As I helped Frank down the ladder, I pieced together his story. He'd been sneaking into houses in the neighborhood, looking for a warm place to sleep. But in this one, his old home, he'd gotten nostalgic. Went up to the attic to look at some of his old things he'd left behind. That's when he fell and got stuck. The homeowner was shocked to learn the truth. "Frank? But I bought this place from a real estate company. They never mentioned..." Frank nodded sadly. "Yeah, they bought it off me when I couldn't keep up the payments. Guess they didn't want to mention the sad sack previous owner." I should have arrested Frank for trespassing. but something about the whole situation tugged at my heartstrings. Instead, I made a call to a buddy who runs a homeless shelter in town. As we waited for the shelter van to arrive, the homeowner, Susan, I learned, brought Frank some food and water. They got to talking, and I watched as initial fear and resentment melted into something like understanding. "You know," Susan said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking of hiring a handyman to help with some repairs around the house. The pay wouldn't be much, but—" Frank's eyes lit up. "Ma'am, I was a contractor for 30 years before things went south. I'd be happy to help out." I left them exchanging contact information, marveling at how the night had turned out. What started as a ridiculous call about a ghost ended up changing 2 lives for the better. As I drove back to the station, I couldn't help but chuckle. In all my years on the force, I'd never encountered a real ghost, but I'd seen plenty of people haunted by their past, their mistakes, their regrets. Sometimes what we need most isn't an exorcism, but a second chance. I still drive by 1542 Aspen Drive sometimes. Frank's got the place looking better than ever, and I often see him and Susan chatting on the porch. It's a good reminder that in this job, you never know what you're going to find when you answer a call. And sometimes the best resolutions come not from enforcing the law, but from a little human kindness. Story 4. In my 15 years on the force, I've seen a lot of strange things, but nothing quite compares to the incident at the Thompson house back in '98. It's the kind of case that sticks with you, that makes you question what you think you know about the world. It was a quiet Saturday night in our small Midwestern town. I was on patrol when a call came in about a possible break-in at 1456 Elm Street. Dispatch said a group of teenagers had reported seeing someone inside the house when the family was supposed to be away. I pulled up to find 4 kids, probably about 16 or 17, standing nervously by their car in the driveway. As I approached, I could see the fear in their eyes. This wasn't some prank gone wrong. These kids were genuinely spooked. "Evening, folks," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Want to tell me what's going on here?" The tallest boy, Jake, stepped forward. "Officer, we came to pick up our friend Tommy. We were supposed to go to the movies, but there's someone in his room, and it's not Tommy." I raised an eyebrow. "You're sure about that?" All 4 nodded vigorously. Another boy, Mike, chimed in. "We've been here for like 20 minutes. We keep seeing someone peeking through the blinds in Tommy's room. We thought he was messing with us at first, but it doesn't feel right." I looked up at the house. It was a typical suburban 2-story, all dark except for a faint glow from a nightlight in one of the lower windows. "And you're certain the family isn't home?" "No way," said a girl named Sarah. "Tommy's family left for his grandma's birthday thing this afternoon. They're not supposed to be back until tomorrow." Just then, another car pulled into the driveway. A middle-aged couple and a teenage boy got out, looking confused. "Officer," the man called out, "is everything all right?" I quickly pieced together that this must be the Thompson family. I explained the situation, watching as their faces grew increasingly concerned. "But that's impossible," Mrs. Thompson said. "We've been gone since 3 p.m. The house was empty, and our alarm was set." I turned to the boy who I assumed was Tommy. "Son, did you maybe forget something and come back without telling your parents?" Tommy shook his head, eyes wide. "No, sir. I've been with them the whole time." At this point, protocol dictated that I treat this as a potential break-in. I called for backup and had everyone stay behind me as I approached the house. Mr. Thompson disabled the alarm and let me in. I did a thorough sweep of the house, room by room, floor by floor. Nothing was disturbed. No signs of forced entry. The alarm log showed it hadn't been deactivated since the family left. It was as if no one had been there at all. When I got to Tommy's room, a chill ran down my spine. The blinds were closed just as the kids had described, but there was no one there and no evidence that anyone had been. I rejoined the group outside, shaking my head. The house is clear. There's no one inside and no signs that anyone has been. The 4 teenagers looked at each other in disbelief. Jake spoke up, his voice shaking slightly. "But officer, we all saw it. Someone kept peeking through those blinds. We saw their eyes." I spent the next hour taking statements from everyone. All 4 kids told the exact same story, down to the number of times they saw the person and the approximate times. They were consistent, coherent, and clearly rattled. In the end, I had no choice but to file it as an unfounded report. There was simply no evidence of any crime or intrusion, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Over the years, I've thought about that night many times. I've run through every possible explanation, tricks of the light, overactive imaginations, some elaborate prank. But none of it quite fits. Those kids saw something that night, something that by all logical accounts couldn't have been there. And yet, 4 separate witnesses all reported the same inexplicable phenomenon. It's cases like these that remind me that there's still so much we don't understand about our world. As police officers, we're trained to look for rational explanations, to follow the evidence. But sometimes, the evidence leads us to places we can't explain. I still drive by the Thompson house sometimes. It looks the same as it always has, just another suburban home on a quiet street. But every time I pass, I find myself glancing up at that second-story window, half expecting to see a pair of eyes peering back at me through the blinds. In this job, we're supposed to protect and serve, to make sense of the chaos and keep our communities safe. But how do you protect people from something you can't see, can't touch, can't even prove exists? I don't have any answers, but I do know this. That night changed the way I look at the world. It taught me that sometimes the most unsettling things are the ones we can't explain. Story 5. I've been with Naval Security Forces for over a decade, but nothing in my training prepared me for what I experienced at Naval Station Argus last year. It's the kind of story that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world. It was a crisp October night, the kind where the fog rolls in thick off the bay, blurring the lines between sea and sky. I was partnered with Officer Martinez, a skeptical veteran of the force who'd seen it all, or so he thought. At 200 hours, the call came in. Another alarm at Building 17, an innocuous-looking office structure that dated back to World War II. As we sped toward the site, Martinez filled me in. "Third time this month," he grumbled. "Always the same. Alarm trips, we show up. Everything's locked tight as a drum. It's getting old." We arrived to find the building dark and silent. Standard procedure. We checked every door, every window, even the roof access. Everything was secure. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of any disturbance. And yet the alarm had definitely been triggered. As we stood puzzling over the situation, a figure emerged from the fog. It was Dr. Elias Kraft, the building's chief researcher, looking disheveled and annoyed. "Not again," he sighed, fumbling with his keys. "I was hoping to get one full night's sleep this week." Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of old books and something else. Ozone, maybe? We swept the building methodically, floor by floor. Everything seemed normal until we reached the 3rd floor. The moment we stepped off the elevator, the temperature dropped noticeably. Our breath fogged in the air. Martinez and I exchanged glances, both of us suddenly on high alert. As we moved down the hallway, I noticed something odd about the photos on the wall. They were all of naval personnel, dating back decades. But in each one, there was a figure that seemed off, blurred, or standing at an impossible angle. We reached Dr. Kraft's office at the end of the hall. The door was closed, but a faint blue light pulsed from beneath it. Dr. Kraft stepped forward to unlock it, his hand visibly shaking. "I should warn you," he said softly. "What's in here? It's classified, and you might not believe what you see." The office beyond was a mess of papers, strange equipment, and glowing screens. But what caught my eye was the large device in the center of the room. It looked like a cross between a radar dish and a Tesla coil, humming with energy. Dr. Kraft cleared his throat. "We've been working on a project. Let's call it temporal imaging, the ability to see echoes of past events." Martinez scoffed. "What, like time travel?" "Not exactly," Kraft replied. "More like peeking through the curtains of time. But something's gone wrong. We're not just seeing the past anymore. I think we're pulling it through." As if on cue, the device pulsed. The air shimmered, and for a moment I saw the office as it might have looked 70 years ago. A figure in an old naval uniform stood by the window, staring right at me with eyes that knew too much. Then it was gone, leaving only the faint smell of cigarette smoke and sea salt. Dr. Kraft slumped into his chair. It's getting stronger. The incursions are lasting longer. I'm afraid we might be tearing the fabric of reality. Martinez looked like he wanted to argue, to find some rational explanation, but I could see in his eyes that he'd seen it too. This was beyond anything in our training manuals. Over the next few weeks, the incidents escalated. Objects from the past would appear in the building, only to vanish hours later. Staff reported seeing figures in outdated uniforms, hearing snippets of conversations from decades ago. The brass tried to keep it quiet, but rumors spread. They eventually shut down the project, sealed off Building 17 entirely. But sometimes on quiet nights when the fog rolls in thick, I swear I can still hear phantom alarms echoing across the base. I've never filed an official report about what I saw that night. Who would believe it? But it's changed the way I view my job and the world. We're trained to protect against tangible threats, intruders, spies, terrorists. But how do you secure a facility against the past itself? How do you maintain order when reality itself becomes fluid? I don't have answers, but I do know this. The line between past and present, between possible and impossible, is far thinner than we'd like to believe. And sometimes the most dangerous intruders are the ones that come not from outside our borders, but from outside our very concept of time and space. So the next time you hear an unexplained alarm in the night or catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there, remember that not all security breaches can be explained by our standard protocols. Some threats transcend time itself, echoing from a past that refuses to stay buried. Story 6, I've been a 911 dispatcher for nearly 2 decades, and in this job, you think you've heard it all. But there's one case that still keeps me up at night, one that blurs the line between paranoia and something else. It started about 5 years ago. Every Thursday, like clockwork, we get a call from Mildred Pearson, an elderly woman living on the outskirts of town. The first few times I handled it like any other call. 911, what's your emergency? They're here again, Mildred would whisper, her voice trembling. The men in black suits. They're trying to read my thoughts. Standard procedure for these types of calls is to send an officer for a wellness check. But after the 3rd week, with resources stretched thin, I started talking to Mildred myself. At first, I thought it was just a lonely old woman seeking attention. But as the weeks went by, I began to notice patterns. Mildred always called at exactly 9:17 p.m. She always reported the same symptoms: a high-pitched ringing in her ears, a metallic taste in her mouth, and the sensation of being watched. And every time she insisted that black vehicles were parked just out of sight of her property. I started logging these calls meticulously against protocol. Something about Mildred's consistency, her genuine terror, nagged at me. About 6 months in, things escalated. Mildred called, frantic, saying she'd covered her entire house in aluminum foil. It's the only way to block their signals, she insisted. When an officer finally went to check on her, he reported that the place looked like a badly wrapped Christmas present. Mildred had even fashioned herself a foil hat. Most of my colleagues laughed it off. Another crazy old lady, they said. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something. I started doing my own research off the clock. I looked into government projects involving electromagnetic frequencies, mind control experiments, even UFO sightings in our area. Most of it seemed like conspiracy theory nonsense, but there were enough credible reports to keep me digging. Then about a year into Mildred's calls, something changed. She called on a Tuesday, her voice calmer than I'd ever heard it. They made contact, she said simply. I know what they want now. Before I could ask for clarification, the line went dead, and Mildred never called again. I tried to follow up, even drove by her house once. The foil was gone. The place looked normal. When I knocked, a young couple answered. They just moved in, they said. No, they didn't know anything about the previous owner. It was like Mildred Pearson had simply vanished. I filed a missing persons report, but without any evidence of foul play, it didn't go far. My superiors told me to let it go. Just another lonely old woman who'd probably moved into a care facility. But I couldn't shake it. The consistency of her calls, the sudden change, her disappearance. It all felt wrong. A few months after Mildred's last call, I noticed something strange. Every Thursday at exactly 9:17 p.m., my computer would glitch. Just for a second, barely noticeable if you weren't looking for it. And in that moment, I swear I could hear a faint, high-pitched ringing. I requested our IT department check it out, but they found nothing. No one else seemed to notice it. Just me. Last week, I was driving home from a late shift when I saw them. 3 black SUVs, parked on the side of the road near where Mildred used to live. As I passed, I felt a sudden metallic taste in my mouth. I haven't told anyone else about this. They'd think I was crazy, that Mildred's paranoia had rubbed off on me. Hell, maybe I am crazy, but I can't shake the feeling that Mildred was right, that there's something out there, something beyond our understanding. I've started lining my bedroom with aluminum foil. My wife thinks I'm having some kind of breakdown. Maybe I am. But every Thursday night at 9:17 p.m., I sit by my ham radio, listening, waiting, because I think Mildred was trying to warn us about something. And I have a terrible feeling that one day, probably a Thursday at 9:17 p.m., we're all going to find out what it was. So if you're ever driving through our town on a Thursday night and you see black SUVs parked on the side of the road, don't stop. Don't even slow down. And whatever you do, don't answer if you hear a high-pitched ringing in your ears. Some frequencies are better left unheard.
Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.